What if someone is watching you right now, measuring your character in the moments when you think nobody's looking? What if your smallest act of kindness, the help you gave when you expected absolutely nothing in return, was being cataloged by a stranger who understood that true virtue reveals itself only in silence? Rosie's diner woke slowly with the dawn, its neon sign flickering like a restless heartbeat against the pale Carolina sky. Inside, the scent of burnt coffee and artificial vanilla syrup lingered from the night shift, mixing with the sharp tang of grease that never truly left the air. The fluorescent lights hummed a weary melody overhead, illuminating a place that had seen too many mornings and too few miracles. Emma Torres moved through it all like a dancer in slow motion, refilling sugar dispensers, stacking chipped mugs, folding napkins into half-remembered symmetry. There was a rhythm to her motion, born of survival rather than grace. Her shoulders carried the invisible weight of overdue bills. Her eyes held the dull glow of sleepless endurance. And yet she smiled at customers who never learned her name. Outside, the sky blushed faintly behind the diner's smeared windows. Inside, Emma poured the first pot of coffee of the day, unaware that this ordinary morning, the smell, the hum, the repetition, was quietly setting the stage for a moment that would change everything. Emma Torres was 26 years old and drowning in the kind of debt that becomes a second heartbeat. $43,000 in student loans from a nursing degree she never finished. A dream that had died somewhere between organic chemistry and the realization that she couldn't afford both tuition and food. 3 eviction notices sat in her purse like ticking bombs, each one stamped with dates that grew closer together. Her apartment was a studio in the roughest corner of Charlotte, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's despair, and the heating system worked on a schedule that resembled prayer more than physics. She earned $11.50 an hour at Rosie's Diner, plus tips that rarely exceeded $2 per table. $2. As if the customer was apologizing for eating. She worked doubles, back-to-back shifts that blurred into a single endless morning, just to keep her landlord from changing the locks on whatever remained of her life. Emma's car had a check engine light that had been burning for 6 months. She ignored it the way you ignore a persistent ache, by pretending it didn't exist. Her defining trait, the thing that made her Emma and not just another exhausted body moving through the service industry, was this: she could not stop helping people, even when helping cost her everything. It wasn't nobility, it was necessity. Helping others was the only thing keeping her from becoming invisible, the only proof that she mattered, that her presence on earth registered as anything other than a shadow. She arrived at Rosie's at 5:30 a.m. every morning, 40 minutes before the first customer. She set up stations with practiced precision. Napkins folded into thirds, silverware arranged by size, water glasses polished, until they caught the fluorescent light like captured stars. She moved through the diner like a ghost, acknowledged by no one, essential to everyone, present but fundamentally unseen. Margaret Holloway arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 6:47 a.m., her wheelchair announcing her with a sound like an animal in pain. The left wheel squealed, a high-pitched, metallic scream that cut through the breakfast rush and made people wince. Margaret herself was 73 years old, rail-thin in a way that suggested she'd been stretched by time rather than fed by it. Her silver hair was pulled back so aggressively tight that it seemed to stretch her scowl even wider, as if her face had been left too long in a vice. She never ordered. Not coffee, not water, not the daily special that Rosie advertised with laminated signs. Margaret simply rolled herself to the corner booth by the kitchen doors, the one with the torn vinyl seat and the view of absolutely nothing, and sat there like a sentinel guarding a place that didn't want to be guarded. The other servers had already given up on her. Danny had nicknamed her the wheelchair ghost within her first week. Comes in, orders nothing, tips nothing, says nothing. Complete waste of space. He said it loud enough for Margaret to hear, as if rudeness was more honest than indifference. The staff treated her as invisible furniture, necessary to acknowledge, but not worth engaging. Customers steered clear of her corner. Something about Margaret's expression suggested that conversation would be punished. Even Rosie, who prided herself on knowing every regular by name and coffee preference, had simply accepted Margaret's presence without question or care. The old woman existed in Rosie's diner the way a clock exists on a wall, ticking away time, requiring no interaction, demanding no acknowledgement. Margaret sat in that corner booth like a test nobody wanted to take, a moral exam written in silence and threadbare clothes. Her garments hung on her frame like they'd been borrowed from someone larger, a faded cardigan with buttons missing, a shirt so worn the pattern had almost surrendered to time. She wore no jewelry, no accessories, nothing that suggested she'd ever expected to matter to anyone. Her eyes, when they opened fully, held the color of winter sky, pale, distant, showing no invitation for connection. She was the kind of person people learn to look through rather than at. But Emma saw what others had learned to ignore. She saw the tremor in Margaret's hands when the old woman tried to lock the wheelchair brake, a small trembling that suggested either age or fear, or the exhausting effort of maintaining control over a body that had begun to betray her. She saw the split in the vinyl seat cushion, patched with duct tape that was itself splitting, creating layers of failed repairs like geological evidence of time passing without mercy. She saw the way Margaret's eyes tracked the food passing by on other tables, not with hunger exactly, but with something quieter, something that looked like loneliness wearing the mask of defiance. On Margaret's second appearance, Emma brought her coffee. Black. No sugar. The exact order that Margaret had never requested, never indicated she wanted, never gave Emma any reason to believe she'd appreciate. Emma simply set it down beside the empty booth, didn't ask if it was wanted, didn't expect thanks. She simply walked away. Margaret didn't acknowledge it. She stared at the steam rising from the cup like she was reading tea leaves, searching for meaning in the white wisps curling upward. But 2 days later, when Margaret rolled herself into the diner on Thursday morning, Emma brought the coffee again. And again on Tuesday. And again on Thursday after that. This became the ritual. Emma would emerge from the kitchen at 6:50 a.m., spot the wheelchair in the corner, and move without hesitation. She'd set down a cup of black coffee, the ceramic warm against her fingers, the steam rising like small ghosts, and retreat. Margaret never said thank you. The old woman never acknowledged Emma's presence with anything more than a slight shift in her eyes. A millisecond of recognition that might have been gratitude or might have been nothing at all. But Emma continued anyway. The gesture was so small it was almost invisible. Almost. A cup of coffee that took 30 seconds to pour, a walk across the diner that took another 30 seconds, a moment of service that registered on no financial ledger and earned no tip. But Emma brought that coffee anyway, twice a week, without fail, without expectation. The way some people pray to a God they're not sure is listening. It was the smallest ritual. And it would change everything. 3 weeks of quiet ritual. 21 days of coffee, appearing, and silence, remaining unbroken. Then came the Tuesday morning, when everything shifted. Margaret rolled into Rosie's diner at 6:47 a.m., right on schedule, right on time. But something was different. The wheelchair listed dangerously to one side. The left wheel no longer squealing, but simply dead, surrendered completely to whatever had been slowly destroying it. Margaret was frozen in the chair, unable to move forward without tipping catastrophically to the right, unable to move backward without the same disaster. She sat there, trapped between immobility and danger. The breakfast crowd flowed around her like water around a stone, parting instinctively to avoid collision, moving past without stopping, without seeing. A family of 4 stepped around her, without missing a beat in their conversation. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced in her direction, and then looked away. Rosie saw her from behind the counter, and made a mental note to address it later, to call someone to handle it. But not now, not in the middle of the morning rush. Margaret sat perfectly still, her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on nothing. She didn't call for help. She didn't wave. She simply existed in that trapped state, becoming even more invisible than before, a problem to be navigated around rather than solved. Then Emma emerged from the kitchen. She didn't hesitate. She didn't check with Rosie or ask another server to help. She simply knelt beside the wheelchair, her knees hitting the worn linoleum with a soft thud that made Margaret flinch slightly. "Let me help," Emma said quietly. Not a question. Not a request for permission. Just a simple statement of intention. She examined the wheelchair with the focus of someone who understood that broken things matter. The left wheel's axle was bent beyond simple repair. The bolt holding the assembly together had stripped. The entire mechanism was held together by nothing but determination and hope, both of which were clearly running out. Emma disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a wrench from the utility drawer and a roll of electrical tape. Her hands moved with purpose, testing and adjusting, tightening and reinforcing. 15 minutes later, the wheel wasn't perfect, but it rolled straight. Margaret's eyes met Emma's for the first time. There was no gratitude in that look, no softness, no tears, no recognition of debt or obligation. There was something harder, something that looked like a test being passed, a moment of verification. Neither woman knew that someone else had been watching through the diner's front window. Someone with a leather-bound journal and the patience of someone who understood that character reveals itself only when no one important is watching. 3 weeks became a ritual. Every Tuesday at 6:47 a.m., Emma brought the black coffee. Every Thursday at 6:47 a.m., she brought it again. Margaret sat in the corner booth, her wheelchair wheel rolling smoothly now, and they existed in a quiet understanding neither had named. It wasn't friendship, exactly. It was something simpler and more profound, two people occupying the same space without the burden of explanation. Then came the Tuesday when the booth remained empty. Emma arrived at 5:30 a.m. as always. She set up the stations, folded the napkins, polished the glasses. At 6:47 a.m., she moved toward the kitchen to pour the black coffee, and stopped. The corner booth sat dark and untouched. The chair that should have held Margaret was bare, waiting for a person who didn't arrive. Emma told herself it meant nothing. Margaret got sick. Margaret moved away. Margaret found somewhere else to sit. The mind constructs these small narratives the way it builds walls against panic. But Emma knew better. She felt it in her chest like a hand gripping her heart, squeezing down with the certainty of something ending. All day she moved through her shift distracted, her attention fractured. She checked the door every time the bell chimed, that small brass bell that announced arrival or departure. Each time she hoped to hear the familiar squeak of the wheelchair. Each time she was disappointed. By noon, the disappointment had become something heavier. By 3 o'clock, it had crystallized into something she couldn't name. Thursday arrived like a question without an answer. Emma brought the coffee anyway, muscle memory, ritual, hope expressed through the simple act of pouring black liquid into ceramic. She set it in the empty booth. It sat there untouched all morning, growing cold. The steam long since surrendered to the diner's stale air. By the end of her shift, Emma hadn't moved it. She'd left it there like an offering to a god she wasn't sure existed anymore. The absence had become a presence, a space that shouldn't be empty, but was. Margaret's empty booth was louder than her silence had ever been. It was the loudest thing in Rosie's diner. It was all Emma could hear. Thursday morning, 9:15 a.m. The breakfast rush had peaked and begun its slow decline when the door opened. 5 men stepped through simultaneously, as if choreographed by someone with military training. They didn't shuffle or hesitate. They moved with precision that felt utterly wrong in a place built for comfort and casualness. Wrong the way a SWAT team would look in a kindergarten classroom. They wore expensive suits, the kind that costs more than most people earn in a month, and they wore them like armor. Their shoulders were broad in ways that suggested deliberate training, their posture rigid with the discipline of people accustomed to being intimidating. The entire restaurant fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused midair, suspended between plate and mouth. The background noise of sizzling griddles, clattering dishes, and casual chatter seemed to hush instantaneously, as if someone had reached in and turned down the volume on the world. It wasn't just quiet, it was the specific silence that precedes something significant. The silence of attention. The men scanned the diner like soldiers searching for a target. Their eyes moved across the booths, cataloging faces, assessing the room. Then one of them stepped forward, silver-haired, immaculate in a way that suggested expensive tailoring and careful maintenance. He moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, the kind of person who expected rooms to reorganize themselves around his presence. He walked directly toward Emma. She was wiping down the counter, moving through the muscle memory of service, when she realized he was walking toward her. The counter suddenly felt too small, too fragile, too exposed. The man stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and precise. He looked at her with the certainty of someone reading from a script he'd already memorized. "Are you Emma Torres?" he asked. Not a greeting, not a question seeking information. The way he said it suggested he already knew the answer and was simply confirming what he'd been told. The world held its breath. Emma's stomach dropped. The question opened a door to every fear she'd learned to carry. Police? Debt collection? Eviction notice hand-delivered by a man in an expensive suit? The possibilities arranged themselves in her mind like dominoes waiting to fall. The man continued before she could speak, before the questions could climb out of her throat. Margaret Holloway passed away peacefully 3 days ago. She was found in her apartment on Sycamore Street. Her attorney has requested your immediate presence. The words fell like stones into still water. Margaret, dead. The quiet old woman who sat in the corner booth was gone. The woman Emma had brought coffee to, black, no sugar, twice a week, had surrendered to whatever it was that ended people. Emma felt the floor shift beneath her, as if the linoleum had suddenly become unreliable. The breakfast crowd pretended not to listen while listening to every word. The other servers had stopped moving. Rosie emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the magnetic pull of drama unfolding in her establishment. Emma's mind spun in circles. She barely knew this woman, barely exchanged more than a dozen words with her. They'd existed in each other's presence the way furniture exists in a room, silent, parallel, separate. And yet somehow, impossibly, Emma was the first person this lawyer had come to find. "I don't understand," Emma managed. Her voice sounded very small in the suddenly enormous diner. The man's expression didn't soften. It simply waited for her to catch up to reality. The lawyer reached into his jacket with deliberate precision. He produced a photograph and set it on the counter between them. Emma recognized it immediately. It was the corner booth at Rosie's diner, photographed from outside through the front window. She could see herself in it, kneeling beside the wheelchair, her hands on that broken axle, focused completely on the task of fixing something that wasn't hers to fix. The image was slightly grainy, taken through glass and distance, but unmistakable in its specificity. Margaret was quite clear about who to find, the lawyer said. His voice carried the weight of someone delivering a message. She described you as the young woman who fixes things she wasn't asked to fix. She said you would understand why that matters. Then he began to speak, and Emma realized he was describing her life back to her, details that could only have come from observation. The black coffee, no sugar. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:47 a.m. The ritual no one else knew about. The moment she'd repaired the wheelchair wheel, not the sanitized version, but the actual moment. The bent axle, the stripped bolt, the 15 minutes on worn linoleum. Details that suggested Margaret hadn't simply noticed Emma's kindness. Margaret had watched. Margaret had documented. Margaret had taken notes. Margaret observed you for weeks, the lawyer continued. She witnessed your kindness toward someone the entire diner had dismissed as invisible. She watched you help without expectation of recognition or gratitude. She saw your character when you believed no one important was watching. The proof was devastating in its specificity. Margaret had been testing Emma. Margaret had been cataloging her choices like a scientist documenting a species. Margaret had been watching from outside the window, making entries in a leather-bound journal, understanding that character reveals itself only in silence. Emma had passed a test she didn't know she was taking, and Margaret had decided to change her entire life as a result. The lawyer's car was a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the kind of vehicle that Emma had only seen from the outside, passing on the street, representing a world she couldn't access. The leather seats were soft enough to feel like sin. The smell of expensive cologne mingled with furniture polish created an atmosphere that was almost aggressive in its wealth. The engine barely whispered as it navigated through Charlotte's downtown streets, moving with the smooth confidence of something engineered for perfection. Emma sat in the back seat wearing her Rosie's Diner uniform. Her name tag was still clipped to her apron. The contrast was surreal. Her worn polyester uniform next to leather that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Her reflection in the tinted window showed her a version of herself she barely recognized. Exhausted, shell-shocked, out of place in a car that had been designed for a completely different kind of person. She watched the city pass by from behind tinted glass, seeing her world from a perspective she'd never inhabited. The streets she usually walked looked different from this height, from behind this kind of protection. They looked like something she was observing rather than something she belonged to. The car pulled smoothly toward the downtown financial district, all glass and steel towers that seemed designed to intimidate through sheer height and architectural precision. The Mercedes pulled to a stop in front of a building of glass and steel, all sharp angles and intimidating geometry. It rose 34 stories into the Charlotte skyline. A security guard in a uniform opened the car door and escorted Emma inside. The lobby was marble and minimalism, a space designed to communicate that money had been here, was here, and always would be here. The elevator rose silently. Emma's hands were shaking. She clasped them together, trying to will them into stillness. But the tremor persisted. The elevator climbed with the smooth inevitability of something guided by invisible machinery, carrying her toward a moment she wasn't prepared for. The doors opened on the 34th floor. Everything changed. The law office was everything Rosie's Diner wasn't. Marble floors reflected the light from overhead fixtures like they were mirrors to the sun. Panoramic windows overlooked the entire city. Charlotte spread out below like a map waiting to be understood. Modern art decorated the walls. Abstract pieces that probably had stories Emma would never know, painted by artists whose names carried weight in worlds she'd never inhabited. A single painting probably cost more than Emma made in 5 years of working doubles at the diner. 3 people were already in the conference room when Harrison Wells escorted Emma inside. They turned to look at her in unison, their eyes cataloging her appearance with the precision of customs officials at a border. The first was a man in his 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than Emma's rent. It wasn't just expensive, it was perfectly expensive, tailored and maintained with a kind of attention that suggested wealth had been instructing his appearance since childhood. The second was a younger woman with cold eyes and a designer purse. She examined Emma with the disinterest of someone looking at a filing cabinet. The third was an older man with silver hair and an expression of patient wisdom. He watched the interaction unfold with the bearing of someone who had seen this performance many times before. The man in the expensive suit stood as Emma entered. He was Margaret's grandson. Emma would learn this within seconds, and his lip curled with barely concealed disdain as he looked at her. "This is who we've been waiting for," he said, not to Harrison Wells, but to the room itself, as if speaking aloud would make the situation somehow less ridiculous. "This is who Margaret left something to?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. His name was Robert Holloway Jr., 52 years old, Margaret's grandson. He carried an expression of perpetual disappointment at a world that refused to cater to his expectations. He saw Emma's uniform, the worn polyester, the coffee stains on the hem, the name tag clipped to her apron, and his mind seemed to complete an equation instantly. "A waitress," he said, his voice rising with something that wasn't quite shock but operated in the same neighborhood. "A diner waitress?" He laughed, a sharp, brittle sound with no joy in it, no warmth, just the sound of someone finding something absurd. Grandmother always did have sentimental delusions. I suppose she thought leaving something to a struggling server was romantic, like she was some kind of fairy godmother playing with toy people. His sister Catherine smirked from across the room. She was younger than Robert, but carried the same expression of entitlement, the look of someone who believed the world should be arranged according to their preferences. The younger woman, the attorney, was named Amanda Chun, and she watched all of this with the patience of someone who had witnessed this performance before, probably many times. Robert continued without waiting for response. Whatever pittance grandmother decided to waste on charity, I trust the bulk of the estate goes to family. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the certainty of someone who had never been denied, who had inherited not just money, but the unshakable belief that money should continue to flow toward him like water finding its level. The room settled into an uncomfortable quiet. Emma stood there in her Rosie's uniform, surrounded by mahogany and marble, while a man who had never worked a double shift in his life explained what his grandmother's death meant to him. The equation was simple. Margaret's money belonged to Robert. Anything given to anyone else was fundamentally wrong. Harrison Wells opened the leather-bound document with the ceremonial care of someone handling something sacred. His reading glasses settled on his nose. His voice adopted the formal cadence of someone reading a legal document, precise, measured, emotionless in the way that only lawyers can be. Robert's face grew darker with each sentence. To his son, a trust fund of $2 million. To his daughter, $1.5 million. To his sister Catherine, $1.8 million. These were life-changing amounts for most people. They were the kind of money that could pay off debt, buy property, fundamentally alter the trajectory of a life. Robert received these amounts like punches. That's it, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward with a sound like protest. That's everything? After 60 years of building this family? After everything grandmother accumulated? His voice carried rage, not grief, but fury at being disappointed. His hands were shaking. His face had reddened to a shade that suggested his blood pressure was climbing toward dangerous altitudes. The money that would transform Emma's life forever was treated by Robert as an insult. He expected more. He had anticipated more. He had constructed his entire future around the belief that he would inherit substantially more. Margaret's wealth wasn't hers to enjoy. It was his to inherit. Her life, her choices, her decades of financial discipline, all were supposed to flow toward him like water finding its inevitable level. And, instead, she had disappointed him. Predictably, profoundly, completely. Harrison Wells adjusted his reading glasses. The room held its breath. Then he continued, his voice steady and professional, as if Robert's rage was simply background noise to be ignored. To Emma Torres, in recognition of her character, the sum of $500,000, to be distributed immediately and without condition. The words landed like a bomb detonating in slow motion. The room went silent, a deeper silence than before. Robert's face turned colors Emma didn't know existed in human physiology. Catherine's smirk died instantly. Amanda Chin, the attorney, made a note on her legal pad with the precision of someone documenting a man's humiliation for the record. Emma felt the words hit her like a physical force. $500,000. The number was so large it stopped making sense somewhere in her mind. Her student debt, $43,000, gone. Her rent for 5 years, covered. Her electric bills, her car payment, her landlord's threats, her 3 eviction notices. All of it dissolved like snow in sunshine. That's absurd. Robert's voice climbed higher, losing the veneer of sophistication. That's unconscionable. A woman she barely knew. A waitress who probably manipulated her into this. I'm contesting this immediately. He was standing now, his hands clenched into fists, his face the color of rage. But Harrison Wells simply adjusted his glasses and continued reading, moving past Robert's protest with the indifference of someone who had expected exactly this reaction. The will was clear. Margaret's intentions were documented. Legal challenge would fail, though Robert wouldn't learn this until much later, after considerable expense and humiliation. Emma stood there in her Rosie's uniform, surrounded by people who understood the power of money in ways she was only beginning to comprehend, and tried to remember how to breathe. Additionally, Harrison read, his voice continuing with the relentless precision of someone reading a grocery list. I leave to Emma Torres the property located at 1247 Maple Street, Charlotte, North Carolina, and all contents therein. Robert laughed, a desperate, furious sound that contained no humor. She left her a building? What building? What could possibly? He stopped. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He understood in that moment what Emma was only beginning to realize. His grandmother owned property scattered throughout Charlotte. Properties nobody talked about in family meetings. Properties that seemed modest and unremarkable in the grand accounting of her wealth. One of them was suddenly Emma's. That dilapidated building downtown. Robert's voice had developed a tremor. The one grandmother bought in 1987 and never touched? That's worthless. It's full of tenants who pay nothing. It requires constant repair. It's a tax liability. His voice climbed higher, becoming almost shrill. You can't give her something that costs money to own. That's insane. Catherine was staring at her brother now, with something like pity. The attorney did not look up from her notes. She was still writing, still documenting the precise moment when Robert Holloway Jr. began to lose control of his narrative. Emma said nothing. She simply stood there, processing the fact that she apparently now owned a building. A building that generated ongoing costs. A building that was apparently burdensome enough that Robert was treating it like a curse rather than an asset. What she didn't know, what Robert in his panic didn't know, was that he was only halfway through the revelation. Harrison Wells removed his reading glasses slowly. He set them down on the document with deliberate care. He reached into his briefcase and removed a second document, this one thicker, more technical, filled with numbers and legal language that suggested financial complexity. However, he continued, and the word hung in the air like a door opening. Attached to that property is Margaret's investment portfolio, which generates $247,000 annually. The building itself, once properly managed, generates an additional $89,000 in rental income. The combined value of these assets, including the real estate holdings and the business operations contained therein, is approximately $8.2 million. The words settled over the room like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Robert staggers backward. Catherine's face goes pale. Amanda Chin makes another note on her legal pad, not documenting facts now, but witnessing history. Emma can't feel her hands. The numbness spreads from her fingertips up through her arms like frostbite in reverse. $8 million. Not 800,000. 8 million. It wasn't a cage, Harrison says quietly, looking directly at Emma. It was a kingdom. Robert's voice comes out broken, fractured, barely audible. She left her $8 million? And left us. He can't finish the sentence because there are no words adequate to describe the depth of his humiliation. His mind is trying to calculate the ratio. Margaret gave him $2 million. She gave Emma 8. The mathematics of her choice are devastating. Margaret had given him money, significant money, the kind that most people would consider life-changing, transformative, enough to build a comfortable life with. And it felt like nothing compared to what the waitress had received. Because Robert had expected everything, had calculated his inheritance as a certainty, had structured his emotional architecture around the belief that his grandmother's wealth would ultimately be his. And Emma had expected nothing. The difference is everything. After the will is Reed. After Robert storms out making threats he'll never follow through on. After Catherine leaves with her sister still staring at her in disbelief. After the room empties like a theater at intermission. Harrison shakes Emma's hand and tells her to take time to process. His expression is gentle. He's seen this before. He knows that wealth hits people like a physical blow. He escorts her to a private study on the 33rd floor. The room smells like old paper and leather, the smell of time preserved in volumes and binding. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves line 3 walls, their shelves heavy with books that have been read and annotated and lived with. A mahogany desk sits facing a window that overlooks the entire city, positioned so that whoever sat there could watch Charlotte unfold below them. The afternoon light slants through the glass, illuminating dust particles that dance like tiny mysteries in the golden rays. Harrison produces a key, old, brass, with an engraving on the handle. It looks ancient, like it's been waiting a very long time to be used for exactly this purpose. Margaret said you would understand, he tells Emma. She said you would see what others couldn't. He places the key in her palm, closes her fingers around it, and leaves her alone in the study. Emma stands in the center of the room, afraid to touch anything. This space feels sacred. This space feels like a confession written in books and furniture and carefully preserved light. She moves toward the desk slowly, like approaching a shrine, her hand trailing across the back of a leather chair. The drawer opens quietly, as if it's been waiting for her, as if everything in this room has been arranged for this exact moment. Inside lies revelation. Files. Hundreds of them, each one meticulously labeled with dates and names and cities. Emma pulls one at random, a file marked Seattle, 2004. Inside are photographs, newspaper clippings, financial statements. A small business documented through images, the coffee shop's exterior, its interior, the people who worked inside. Then Emma finds a photograph of a younger Margaret, maybe 40 years old, standing with a man she doesn't recognize. He's holding her hand. They're both smiling. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that must be Margaret's, Thomas. Before. Before what? Emma returns to the file drawer. There are dozens of files. Seattle, Denver, Kansas City, Portland, San Francisco. Each one contains the same pattern. A small business, photographs documenting its growth, financial records showing consistent profits, and then a photograph of Margaret with the same man, or photographs of Margaret alone, or in later files, just photographs of the business itself. Emma begins to understand what she's looking at. Margaret has spent decades creating small businesses in cities all over America. She's been funding them, nurturing them, watching them grow. But why? What is the pattern? What connects a coffee shop in Seattle with a bakery in Denver with a bookstore in Kansas City? The final file is marked Charlotte, 2001. It contains the deed to 1247 Maple Street, the property that is now Emma's. It contains the history of every improvement made to that building, documented through photographs and receipts. It contains the names of every tenant who has lived there, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, along with their rental history. Some tenants have lived there for 15 years, others for 5, but each one seems to have been carefully selected. And then Emma finds a photograph of Margaret and the same man, now older, grayer, fragile in a way that suggests illness, sitting together in what looks like 1247 Maple Street. They're in what appears to be the main room of the building. They're holding hands. They're smiling. On the back, a date and 3 words, our last day. Emma finds the leather-bound journal on a shelf, Margaret's own handwriting, dates spanning 20 years. The cover is worn from handling, the pages dog-eared from repeated reading. She opens it randomly, and her eyes fall on an entry dated 15 years ago. Found another one today. Young man in Phoenix. Works 2 jobs, takes care of his sister, never complains. Reminds me so much of you, Thomas. Reminds me of the person you were before the world tried to break you. Emma keeps reading. The entries become a chronicle of Margaret's secret life. She had been searching. For decades, she had been traveling to different cities, observing ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Small acts of kindness. Sustained virtue under pressure. People choosing to help when helping would cost them something. Each person she documented received a gift eventually. Sometimes an investment, sometimes a business loan, sometimes just the knowledge that someone had seen them, that their character had been witnessed and found worthy. The journal reveals Margaret's grief layered beneath every page like a foundation. Thomas, her husband, Emma realizes, had died 30 years ago. He was a kind man, a man who helped people, a man who believed in what he called the invisible economy of kindness, the idea that generosity creates currents in the world that we never see the end of, but that matter nonetheless. He died too young, heart attack. One moment here, the next moment gone. After his death, Margaret became wealthy through investments Thomas had made. But money meant nothing without him. So she spent those decades doing what Thomas couldn't finish, watching ordinary people, cataloging their character, and rewarding the ones who passed her test. She was trying to build a legacy of kindness. She was trying to finish what Thomas had started. She was trying to live in a way that honored his memory. Every business file in that drawer represented someone Margaret believed in. Every tenant in 1247 Maple Street had been chosen because they reminded Margaret of who Thomas was. Emma finds the section marked Emma Torres in the journal. The first entry is dated 18 months ago, before Emma even met Margaret, before she'd ever set foot in Rosie's diner, before the wheelchair or the coffee or any of it. It reads, "Came to Rosie's diner on a Wednesday morning. Watched a young woman work a double shift. She helped a customer who was rude to her. She brought coffee to every table even though her feet were bleeding through her shoes. She worked through a personal phone call. I heard her tell someone she couldn't afford to take time off. That's character. That's Thomas." Emma's hands are shaking. The entries continue, documenting her shifts over the following weeks and months. She fixed my wheelchair today without being asked. She didn't expect thanks. She asked for nothing in return. I sat there for 3 hours after she left, just feeling seen. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt like I was looking at his reflection. Later entries describe Emma's struggles as documented through observation. She's drowning in debt, but still helps others. She has nothing but gives freely. She works doubles and never complains. She has passed the test Thomas would have wanted her to pass. And then, dated the week before Margaret died. I'm leaving tomorrow. The doctors say the cancer has spread. I have maybe days left, maybe hours. But I need Emma to know that character matters, that kindness is witnessed, that virtue never disappears. It just waits for the right moment to bloom. Emma sits down in Margaret's chair at Margaret's desk, looking out at Charlotte spread below her like a map of possibilities, and allows herself to cry. Margaret had been watching her. Margaret had understood her. Margaret had seen in Emma the same quality that had defined her husband, the stubborn, beautiful refusal to stop helping even when helping cost everything. And Margaret had decided that Emma deserved to know she'd been seen. Emma sat in her apartment that night, the same studio with the flickering light and the window that didn't close all the way, and allowed herself to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears of someone managing emotion. Real crying. The kind that comes from the body, releasing tension it's been holding for years. She pulled out the 3 eviction notices from her desk drawer. Her hands were shaking as she tore them into pieces, long, deliberate tears that felt like a small ritual of destruction. The papers scattered across her bed like confetti at a funeral. She called the electric company at 11 p.m. and paid her entire bill over the phone. The representative on the line sounded shocked. "You want to pay the full amount tonight?" the woman asked, as if this was an unusual request. Emma realized it probably was. She sat on her bed and said it out loud, testing the words, "I'm not drowning anymore." The relief was physical. Her shoulders dropped as if someone had removed a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. Her breathing deepened. The constant knot of anxiety in her stomach, the one that had been there so consistently it felt like part of her anatomy, finally loosened. She spent the next week handling logistics with the precision of someone executing a carefully planned operation. The $500,000 transferred to her account. It appeared as numbers on a screen, digital evidence of her liberation. She paid off her student debt in a single wire transfer. $43,000 reduced to zero. She watched the balance on that account drop and felt something inside her settle. It was the most satisfying thing she'd ever witnessed. The erasure of obligation expressed in accounting. She paid 6 months of rent in advance. 6 months. Half a year of safety. The landlord called to ask if everything was okay. Emma realized that the sudden payment from her was apparently suspicious enough to warrant concern. She went to the grocery store and bought food. Not ramen noodles and discount bread. Real food. Salmon that cost $14 a pound. Fresh vegetables that hadn't been reduced to the markdown shelf. Expensive cheese with names she couldn't pronounce. She filled her cart with abundance and felt like she was participating in a small miracle. At checkout, the total was $127. She paid it without hesitation. That night, she sat on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by grocery bags, and cried again. This time from pure relief, the knowledge that she could afford to eat well, that she could buy things without calculating the cost against her remaining balance, that survival was no longer the only goal. Then came the harder part, the part that couldn't be solved by wire transfers or paid bills. Emma attended the formal reading of Margaret's will, where ownership of 1247 Maple Street was transferred to her. She sat across from Diane, the property manager who had been maintaining the building for 15 years, and listened as the older woman explained the tenants, the maintenance issues, the income streams, the responsibilities that now belonged to Emma. 8 tenants, 8 families depending on this building for shelter. 8 people whose lives were now connected to decisions Emma would make. She realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that she now owned a business. She had never owned a business. She had never managed anyone. She had never made decisions that affected people's lives and livelihoods. She had poured coffee and cleared tables. She had existed at the bottom of a hierarchy where other people made decisions that affected her. Now she was at the top of a different hierarchy, and the weight of that inversion was almost crushing. But she also realized something else. She wasn't drowning. The money existed. The resources existed. She just had to learn how to use them. Emma decided to return to Rosie's Diner, not immediately to announce her ownership of the building, but simply to work her shifts. She served her tables, moved through her days with a strange new knowledge. This life, this beautiful, exhausting life of small kindnesses, was now her choice rather than her necessity. She could leave any time. She stayed anyway. The difference transformed everything. After her shifts, she went to the building. She walked through the hallways. She met the tenants, not as a landlord conducting an inspection, but as someone genuinely interested in their lives. A single mother on the second floor, named Lisa, mentioned that the heat had been inconsistent all winter. A retired couple on the third floor, named Henry and Rose, wanted to paint their walls but didn't want to violate their lease. A young family on the first floor had a ceiling that leaked when it rained. Emma got 3 quotes for the heat repair and chose the most thorough option, not the cheapest, but the one that would actually solve the problem. She brought paint chips for Henry and Rose to choose from and told them they could paint whatever color they wanted. She hired contractors to fix the ceiling and sat in the apartment while they worked, making sure the work was done properly. She was learning something Margaret had already understood, that care expressed through action transforms relationships. That attending to the details of people's lives says something profound about how much you value them. 3 weeks into her ownership, the boiler died. It didn't gradually fail or give warning signs. It simply surrendered to time and entropy and stopped functioning. On a Tuesday morning in early October, when the temperature outside dropped to 48 degrees, Diane called Emma in a panic. The entire building has no hot water. In October, we need a new system. It's going to cost $18,000. Her voice carried the tone of someone delivering a disaster. Emma's first instinct was to panic. $18,000 was still real money, even with $500,000 in the bank. It represented decisions and priorities. But her second instinct was to remember something. She was no longer drowning. She scheduled an inspection and sat through it taking meticulous notes. The inspector explained the boiler's failure, its age, its irreplaceability. He identified several options at different price points: the cheap system, the moderate system, the good system, the exceptional system. Each one represented a different level of quality and longevity. Emma chose the exceptional system, not the cheapest, not even the moderate option, the best one. She called each tenant and told them that the building would have no hot water for 3 days while the work was done. She told them that she was covering the entire cost completely. No rent reduction, no shared expense. Just the building would be fixed and they wouldn't have to worry about it. A woman on the third floor, Rose, the one who wanted to paint, called Emma back. "You're the new landlord?" the young woman Margaret mentioned. Emma's breath caught. Margaret had spoken to her tenants about her. About Emma. Rose continued. Margaret was always saying that kindness matters. That the people who see you matter. She was right about you. The boiler was replaced. The tenants got their hot water back. But more importantly, they began to understand something. They were living in a building managed by someone who cared whether they were safe and comfortable. Not someone who grudgingly maintained the minimum. Someone who wanted them to thrive. The boiler replacement marked a turning point. The tenants saw that Emma was different from previous management. She responded to maintenance requests within hours instead of days. She didn't raise rent. She asked tenants what they needed, and then she provided it. One tenant, a man named Marcus who worked nights at a warehouse, mentioned casually to Emma that the building's electrical system was outdated. He said the way people mention obvious problems that they've accepted as permanent, as background reality rather than something that could be changed. Emma hired an electrician to perform a full safety audit. The audit cost $2,000 and revealed several code violations, things that technically could wait, things that wouldn't cause immediate disaster, things that previous management had probably ignored for years. Emma got them fixed immediately. Over the next 3 months, she spent $40,000 upgrading the building systems. She improved the common areas. She painted the hallways. She replaced broken door locks. She installed better lighting in the stairwells. Each improvement was small, but cumulatively, they transformed the building from a place people tolerated into a place people felt proud to call home. The tenants began to trust her. More than that, they began to understand that they were living in a building managed by someone who cared about them as human beings rather than rental income sources. Diane, the property manager, pulled Emma aside one afternoon. In 15 years, I've never seen this building maintained at this level. Margaret cared about the tenants. She really did. But she kept things at maintenance level. She fixed things when they broke. You're actually improving their lives. Diane paused. You're different from anyone I've worked with. Emma realized in that moment that her defining trait, the inability to stop helping, had finally found its purpose. She was no longer just a waitress helping one old woman in a diner. She was a landlord helping 8 families build stable lives. She was making decisions that protected people. She was using resources to create safety and dignity. This was what Margaret had understood all along. This was what the inheritance was really for. Emma continued working at Rosie's Diner. She didn't announce her ownership of 1247 Maple Street. She didn't tell anyone she had $500,000 in the bank. She didn't change. She just showed up to work, continued being kind to the customers, continued being present. But there was a difference now, subtle but profound. She worked because she chose to, not because she was drowning. That choice transformed everything. Danny still made his cynical comments about difficult customers, but Emma had developed a response he wasn't expecting. She smiled at him with genuine warmth. She was no longer in survival mode. She could afford to be kind without the desperation underneath it. One morning, a customer came in angry about his eggs being overcooked. He was hostile, speaking to Emma like she was responsible for his bad morning, his bad week, his bad life. Emma remade the eggs without hesitation. The man ate them and calmed down. He apologized for snapping at her. Emma told him, "You're having a hard day. I get it. The eggs are on me." The man's eyes filled with tears. He wasn't crying about the eggs. He was crying because someone had seen his struggle and responded with kindness instead of defensiveness. He told Emma, "You should own a restaurant. You'd be good at it." Emma laughed. But she was also beginning to think about exactly that, combining her skills as a server with her new resources as a building owner. She was beginning to imagine possibilities beyond survival. She was beginning to dream in a way she'd never allowed herself to before. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to build. 2 months after Emma took ownership of 1247 Maple Street, Robert Holloway Jr. made his move. His attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper intentions, contacted Emma with a legal challenge. Robert was arguing that Margaret's will contained evidence of undue influence. The specific allegation Emma as a caregiver figure in Margaret's life, had manipulated an elderly woman into leaving her property and money. It was absurd on its face. Emma barely spoke to Margaret. She'd said maybe 50 words to the old woman in total. Margaret had orchestrated the entire relationship through observation. Emma had brought coffee. Margaret had watched Emma bring coffee. That was the entire foundation of their interaction. But Robert had leverage. He had money for lawyers. Expensive lawyers. The firm he hired was known for tied-up litigation that lasted years and cost fortunes. Legal warfare through attrition rather than merit. His strategy was transparent. Make Emma so exhausted by legal proceedings that she'd settle. Make her sell the property. Let the building and its millions in accumulated value transfer back to the family through compromise. The legal documents arrived like a bomb. But Robert wasn't only attacking through the courts. He was also attacking Emma's reputation. He spread rumors through their social circles, the small world of Charlotte's wealthy families, that she was a gold digger, an opportunist, someone who had specifically targeted Margaret for her wealth. The whispers were designed to poison people's perception before they ever heard her side of the story. The tenants at 1247 Maple Street started receiving letters from Robert's attorneys. The letters claimed the building's title was contested and that maintenance should be suspended pending legal resolution. The implications were clear. Uncertainty equals vulnerability equals a reason to flee. Emma read those letters in her apartment and felt the ground shifting beneath her again, not toward drowning exactly, but toward a kind of erasure. Robert was trying to erase her. He was trying to rewrite the narrative of Margaret's will as the story of a woman being manipulated rather than a woman making a deliberate choice about her own life and legacy. He was trying to write her out of the story entirely. Emma received the legal documents on a Tuesday morning. She sat at her kitchen table and read them with growing horror. The language was designed to wound. Undue influence. Manipulative relationship. Financial exploitation of an elderly woman. It was technically arguing that she was a predator, someone who had preyed on an old woman's vulnerability for personal gain. The allegations were false, provably false, but they were embedded in legal documents, signed by attorneys with credentials, filed in official records. They had the weight of institutional authority. They were hard to completely dismiss just by saying they weren't true. Her friends started asking questions. A few stopped calling. The tenants at the building became nervous. What if the building's ownership was actually contested? What if they were evicted? Emma felt the panic rising in them like a tide, and she understood. They were starting to doubt her. Emma felt something inside her break. Not her resolve exactly, but her sense of safety. She'd escaped drowning only to find herself in another kind of water. Murky, legal, corrosive. Robert was trying to take everything, not because he cared about justice, but because he couldn't accept that Margaret had chosen differently than he'd expected. He was weaponizing the legal system to enforce his expectations against his grandmother's actual choices. Harrison Wells called Emma and invited her to his office. She sat across from him in the same conference room where everything had been revealed, and he explained her options. "You can win this legally," he told her. "We have Margaret's journal. We have her photographs. We have years of documented decision-making. The evidence is overwhelming. We can defeat Robert's claims in court within 6 months." He paused. "But it will cost you $150,000 in legal fees, and it will expose Margaret's private life to public scrutiny." Emma listened. She understood the choice he was presenting. "Or," Harrison continued, "we can try something else. Robert's fundamental weakness isn't in the legal system. It's that he relies on money and family connections. He believes that financial power translates into victory. But he has no actual evidence of wrongdoing. He has no testimony. He has no support from the community." He leaned forward. "What does Robert care about most?" Emma thought about this. The answer was clear. His reputation. His standing with other wealthy families. "Then we don't beat him in court," Harrison said quietly. "We beat him publicly. We tell the story of what happened. We show the evidence. We make him defend his greed in front of the people who matter to him. Emma contacted a journalist she'd met through mutual friends, Sarah Chun, an investigative reporter at the Charlotte Observer. She told her the story, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a narrative. A woman who helped an old woman. A woman who was chosen to receive a gift. A woman who was now being attacked for that kindness. Sarah was skeptical at first. Reporters develop skepticism the way soldiers develop scars. It's a necessary protection. But Emma showed her Margaret's journal. Sarah read the entries documenting Emma's character and Margaret's reasoning. She looked at the photographs, Margaret observing Emma, Emma helping Margaret, the building, the tenants. Sarah understood immediately what she was looking at. This wasn't a story about inheritance. This was a story about class, about character, about the difference between inherited wealth and earned recognition. The article Sarah wrote was devastating to Robert, but not because it attacked him. It was devastating because it told the complete truth. It detailed Margaret's decades-long mission to recognize hidden kindness. It described Emma's struggles, her choices, her continued work at the diner even after receiving the inheritance. It included statements from tenants at 1247 Maple Street describing how Emma improved their lives. It featured Margaret's own words from her journal about why she'd chosen Emma. The article ran on the front page of the Observer's Sunday edition. The reaction was immediate and crushing for Robert. Social media lit up with support for Emma and criticism of Robert. Strangers who'd never met Emma began sharing her story, defending her character, celebrating the fact that Margaret had made her choice and Emma had honored it. Business partners of Robert's began distancing themselves. No one wanted to be associated with someone attacking a woman for accepting a gift from an elderly benefactor. The wealthy families of Charlotte, the ones Robert actually cared about, began viewing him as entitled and small. His law firm received calls from clients expressing concern about his conduct. Senior partners pulled him aside and suggested he settle quickly before this damaged his firm's reputation further. Within a week, Robert's attorney contacted Harrison Wells with a settlement offer, a full withdrawal of the legal challenge, a public apology, and a $50,000 payment to Emma as compensation for legal costs and reputational harm. Emma wanted to reject it. She wanted vindication. She wanted Robert to be destroyed in court. But Harrison advised her, "You won. Robert is publicly humiliated. He's lost social standing. He's lost business relationships. He's paying you to make this go away. This is victory. Accept it." Emma accepted the settlement. But she didn't keep the $50,000. She donated it to a scholarship fund for nursing students who'd struggled with similar debt. She posted a simple statement on social media, "I'm grateful for the opportunity to move forward and continue serving my community." Robert disappeared from public life for 6 months. Emma decided to renovate 1247 Maple Street. Not to make it more expensive, not to displace the tenants, but to preserve its character while upgrading its infrastructure, to honor what Margaret had built while making it safe and beautiful for the people who lived there. She worked with an architect named David who understood her vision immediately, maintained the building's original brick exterior, the part that Robert had called dilapidated, while completely upgrading the interior systems, the electrical, the plumbing, the HVAC, all the invisible infrastructure that made life bearable. She created a small memorial space on the first floor, a sitting area dedicated to Margaret Holloway. The space had soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a small library of books. On the wall was a plaque that read, "This building was created with love." It was restored with the belief that character matters, that kindness is seen, that virtue builds community. Margaret Holloway understood this. She spent her life recognizing it in others. The memorial included a photograph of Margaret and Thomas, the photograph from Emma's discovery of the journal, and a brief biography explaining Margaret's decades-long mission to recognize hidden kindness in ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary virtue. Tenants were given the first right to remain in the building at their current rent rates. No increases, no displacement. They could stay as long as they wanted. Diane, the property manager, was promoted to building director with a significant salary increase and creative control over building operations. She was given the authority to make decisions that would have previously required Emma's approval. "You understand what we're trying to build here," Emma told her. "I trust you." The building generated steady income that allowed Emma to expand her vision. She began buying additional properties, small buildings, apartment complexes, homes, all managed with the same philosophy: provide stable housing while respecting the dignity of the people living there. Her net worth grew steadily. By the end of the first year, she had purchased 4 additional properties. By the end of 2 years, she owned 12. But her lifestyle didn't change dramatically. She still lived in a modest apartment, though a nicer one now, with reliable heat and a window that closed properly. She still worked at Rosie's Diner, though now it was 1 shift a week rather than the desperate doubles she once worked. The other servers began to understand that something had changed in Emma, though she never explained exactly what. She just seemed more present somehow, more at peace, like someone who had found what they were supposed to be doing. Emma opened a non-profit called the Thomas Project, named after Margaret's late husband, the man whose kindness had inspired Margaret's decades-long mission. The organization identified young people working in service industries, waiters, dishwashers, housekeepers, security guards, home health aides, who demonstrated exceptional character under difficult circumstances. It provided them with mentorship, financial support if needed, and connections to educational and career opportunities that could transform their trajectories. The nonprofit was funded by Emma and administered in her building. She worked there 2 evenings a week, conducting interviews and providing guidance. She sat across from people who reminded her of her younger self, exhausted, struggling, but refusing to stop helping others despite the cost to themselves. She discovered what Margaret already knew: there are thousands of people out there choosing kindness in desperate circumstances. There are people working 3 jobs who still find time to help others. There are people living in poverty who practice generosity anyway. The project became a way to systematically recognize what Margaret recognized individually. Emma became something she never imagined: a philanthropist. Not because she was born to wealth, but because she understood its purpose. She understood that money is just crystallized time and effort. It's other people's labor transformed into financial units. And the only meaningful thing to do with it is to transform other people's relationship with time and effort, to give them choices instead of constraints, to buy them freedom. She formed a partnership with the nursing school she'd abandoned years ago. She funded scholarships for students struggling with debt like she was. She funded internship programs that allowed students to get experience without working survival jobs. She named the scholarship the Thomas and Margaret Fund. Every year, the nursing school held a dinner to honor the scholarship recipients. Emma attended and listened to their stories. Some of them reminded her of her younger self so strongly that it hurt: the exhaustion, the sacrifice, the stubborn refusal to give up despite overwhelming odds. She would sit with them and tell them, "I was you, not so long ago, and I want you to know that your character is being seen, that your kindness matters, that the universe is noticing you, even when you think no one is paying attention." One day, a man named Michael approached Emma at Rosie's Diner. Michael had owned a small cafe nearby for years. It was beautiful space, exposed brick, large windows, good light. But the business was struggling. He was considering closing it. He asked Emma if she was interested in buying it. Emma visited the cafe and realized it was exactly the kind of place that could serve the community she was building around 1247 Maple Street. A gathering space. A third place between home and work where people could feel seen and valued. She bought the cafe and kept Michael on as manager. She renames it Margaret's, named after Margaret Holloway. The cafe becomes a gathering space for the neighborhood. Tenants from the building work part-time jobs there, earning above minimum wage income with flexible scheduling. The Thomas Project holds meetings in the back room. Community members began to understand that Margaret's was more than a cafe. It was a philosophy expressed through coffee and conversation. Emma developed a simple business philosophy: pay staff above minimum wage, provide health benefits, offer flexible scheduling, and treat every customer with genuine care. She refused to rush people. She refused to treat them as transaction units. She treated them as human beings worthy of attention. The cafe became unexpectedly successful. Not because it was profitable in the traditional sense, though it was profitable. It became successful because it operated from authenticity rather than exploitation. Emma realized that her defining trait, the inability to stop helping, had become her business model. She discovered something fundamental. You can build something both profitable and meaningful if you're willing to refuse the usual compromises. You can make money while making the world better. They're not mutually exclusive. They're actually interdependent. Margaret's Cafe won awards for community impact. Emma was featured in a regional business journal as an example of purpose-driven entrepreneurship. The article quoted her, "I used to think kindness and success were separate things. But Margaret understood something I'm still learning. Helping people and building something meaningful are the same thing." Emma's life had transformed, but not in the ways she initially imagined. She wasn't living in a mansion. She wasn't taking lavish vacations. She wasn't performing wealth in the ways that Robert expected wealth to be performed. Instead, she'd balanced between the old life and the new one, between waitressing and property ownership, between struggling and succeeding, between receiving Margaret's gift and using it to recognize others' gifts. She still wore her Rosie's Diner name tag one shift a week. She still knew every regular customer's order. She still felt the ache in her feet at the end of a double, even though she rarely worked doubles anymore. But now those experiences felt chosen rather than imposed. She was in that diner because she wanted to be, not because she had to be. She understood poverty not as her current condition, but as something she'd moved through. That understanding made her a better advocate for people currently experiencing it. She could speak from knowledge rather than theory. She could say, "I know what this feels like," and mean it completely. A year after receiving Margaret's inheritance, Emma received a letter. It was postmarked from Margaret's attorney. Inside was a sealed envelope with Emma's name in Margaret handwriting. Emma opened it carefully, already knowing somehow what it would contain. The letter read, "Emma, by the time you receive this, you'll have discovered my journal and understood my mission. I need you to know, you were never a test to pass or a person to save. You were the fulfillment of a promise I made to Thomas 40 years ago. He believed that kindness was the most important thing a person could offer the world. He lived that belief until the day he died. I spent decades recognizing that belief in others, but I was always looking for him. Looking for someone who understood what Thomas understood, someone who could carry his legacy forward. That person is you. The money is for your freedom. The building is for your foundation. This final letter is to tell you, you're not obligated to do anything with what I've given you. But if you're reading this, I know you will. I know you'll understand that inheritance isn't something you hoard. It's something you pass forward. Thank you for being the person Thomas would have wanted to meet. Margaret." Emma kept that letter in her desk at Margaret's Cafe. She reread it often, particularly when making difficult decisions about how to expand her work or when facing the doubt that comes with responsibility. The letter reminded her of something fundamental. She was chosen specifically because of who she already was. Not because of potential. Not because of who she could become, but because of proven character demonstrated in moments when no one important was watching. That understanding transformed how she approached her own responsibility to recognize others. Emma began to understand Margaret's decades-long project not as charity, but as archaeology, excavating the character that exists in ordinary moments, the virtue that builds in silence, the kindness that doesn't announce itself to anyone except those paying attention. She understood that for every Margaret watching and taking notes, there are millions of ordinary people offering extraordinary kindness in circumstances that demand it. People choosing to help when helping costs something. People choosing to see when seeing requires effort. People choosing to care when indifference would be easier. And she understood that her job now was to be that observer, to watch for character, to recognize virtue, to give people permission to believe that their goodness matters. Emma had become what Margaret was, a witness to invisible kindness, a cultivator of character, a recognition system for the people who choose virtue when choosing cruelty would be easier. And every day, she understood more deeply that the greatest investment isn't in buildings or businesses or even money. The greatest investment is in people, in watching them, in recognizing them, in believing that their character is seen and matters and will eventually be honored. That's the real inheritance Margaret left her. Not money, but the understanding that kindness has currency in the world if you know how to recognize it. Think about the small acts of kindness you've performed that nobody saw. The help you gave when you expected nothing in return. The person you noticed when everyone else ignored them. What if someone was watching? What if in a moment you've completely forgotten, you were being observed and cataloged for your character? What if right now someone is taking mental notes about who you really are when nobody important is watching? Consider the invisible people in your own life, the people you've dismissed, overlooked, or failed to acknowledge. You might be one kind act away from changing someone's trajectory, or you might already have been. And perhaps, like Emma, you'll never know until the moment of revelation arrives. If Emma's story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the importance of recognizing hidden kindness, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share the story with someone who needs to be reminded that character matters, that goodness is seen, and that virtue never goes unnoticed forever.